It's time for Truth, a ministry of Truth Family Bible Church in Middleton, Idaho. It's time for Truth exists to glorify God through the edification of His saints in our local church and for the benefit of the church around the world. I'm your host, Pastor Danny Steinmeier. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome once again to another episode of the podcast, wherever you may be and however you may be listening, whether you're on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or YouTube, or whatever other platform you might be accessing our content. We are glad that you are joining us, and so thank you once again for making us part of your day. We love this platform. We love the ability for you to tune in whenever it's most convenient for you. Maybe you're a wife at home and you are sharing this with your family. Maybe you're a wife at home and you're doing your duties and enjoying your time around the house, or maybe you're driving around the kids and you're listening to us. We're really grateful that you're spending some time with us. Maybe you're a man out there providing for your family. You're out in the car. You're on the job site, wherever you may be. Maybe it's a time to put you to sleep. Maybe it's the tone of Gabe Render's voice that just is so soothing.
You've been talking to Josh, haven't you?
Draws you into those sweet Z's at night that just lead you to the land of quiet rest.
I do tend to put my wife to sleep whenever I talk at night. It's true.
Oh, okay.
So
true confessions. True confessions. Well,
so soothing.
Speaking of relationships of husbands and wives, that's sort of the content that we have prepared for you today. We are talking not about the relationship of husbands and wives as they're married, but more along the lines of husbands and wives and how they become such, and what is the best way to think about our young people and our older young people, our single people who need to get married. We do promote, and I preached recently on Biblical Sexuality Sunday, a message. I started off with the quote from the Cross Politic guys: "If you're single, get married." Right, that sort of thing, and I think that's right. Not.
I was like, how far did you go?
Quote. and
if you have children, baptize them on a credible profession of faith.
If you have children, raise them in the fear and admonition.
Okay, there we go.
But no. He who finds a wife finds a good thing.
Amen.
That was my text, and so it's the emphasis that if we're following through with biblical sexuality, then we need to be pursuing marriage, and we want to be preparing young people to be mature so as to be married, and at least available for marriage at the appropriate time when God would bring a suitable spouse to us.
And that's how we solve the immigration crisis right there. Well, make those Christian babies.
That's right. I talked about that. And actually, we're probably next quarter, coming up here soon, we're probably going to be reading The Death of the West by Pat Buchanan as a group of men and everybody who wants to in the church. Looking at that issue of immigration, we've talked about that obviously in a previous episode, but the issue of immigration, the issue of native peoples populating their own country with their children, who raising up progeny and future generations from amongst their own loins and among their own people, to carry on their values into the future. That's what a nation is all about. And when a nation doesn't do that, it's called suicide. Yep. And you have to have a bunch of immigration in order to accommodate for the need for laborers.
But you can't do that if you don't get married.
That's correct.
And it's hard to get married when all of the 20-year-old girls are doing missions, right? We talked about last time. So.
We talked a little bit about that, yeah.
So what should we do? What's the solution?
Well, in both ways too, right? You have the issue of the available young ladies, but where are the available young men as well?
Yes, sir.
There's issues there. So anyway, our plan today is to talk about these types of things and talk about even this concept of courtship. Perhaps that sounds like a very old word or just a very ordinary word that you think might describe just any old thing to get two people to be married. But we want to get a little bit more specific about that and to have a conversation about that amongst some pastors here. We have Pastor Gabe Render. We've already been in jovial terms this evening from Stone Mountain Baptist Church. And we also have Luke Lemberg as well, as the associate or elder, shall we say, at Stone Mountain Baptist. It's always great to have Luke with us as well. So let's get started. And Luke's going to, I think, get us started off with talking about this issue of courtship. And really, what are we talking about, Luke? And maybe give us a little definition. What are we talking about when we're thinking through the issue of how it is a young man and a young woman would come together to pursue marriage?
Right. So really thinking about how we form families, how we form marriages and form new families. There are different ways and ideas that have been done throughout the world. And the one that we want to promote today is that of courtship. And so courtship, as a bare bones definition, is this: a mediated relationship with the intention of marriage. So there's a man and a girl, and then there's a mediator that is helping them come together and just kind of figure out what they need to do in order to be a good match. And so that's the idea, is that we have a mediator, ideally the father of the bride, and then the prospective suitor comes in and then has a relationship with that father. And then once they come to an agreement and once there's an understanding of what's going on, then the father will give away his daughter in marriage. That's the idea. But
so simple.
Exactly. But so
what could go wrong?
Yeah. So basically, it's just like I said, the bare bones kind of definition is a mediated relationship with the intention of marriage.
So is Luke, are we going this route because we've kissed dating goodbye? Is that the
hey,
too soon?
You know what? I know a lot of people like really push back on the purity culture, but that book really changed my life when I was younger. And actually, the Ludys, Eric and Leslie Ludy, When God Writes Your Love Story, yeah, it totally changed my understanding. That was very helpful to read when I was a 15-year-old boy. I'm just telling you. Even if some of that stuff went sideways.
Well, so a little bit, a little bit sideways.
Just a little sideways.
So if I could just press on this a little bit, Luke, we're bringing up courtship. This sounds to some degree fairly foreign to our modern ears, our modern sensitivities, maybe foreign to our own experiences, wherein maybe we didn't court the people listening. Maybe they didn't, didn't go through a courtship process. Maybe some people in the church have never done it or seen it done. So maybe if you don't mind just a moment, maybe let's talk about, well, is there anything broken about the alternative system? Well, what would be some of the issues why we would say, let's talk about courtship. Maybe we first should talk a little bit about dating and what that is, and does anybody even know?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. So we'll talk about it a little bit later, but courtship has actually been the model for thousands of years. It's really within the last couple hundred years, if you think about it, with the rise of industry and factories and office jobs and things like that, where courtship has kind of gone by the wayside, and this kind of dating idea has started to come to a rise. So you think about it, 1800s, early 1800s, if I had to move out west and build my own house and raise my own crops, and there was a father there who wanted to make sure I could actually do that, that makes sense. So that's where the courtship idea is like, hey, I can build a house, I can take care of animals, I can take care of your daughter. She will be safe out in the West or wherever we're at. But once you start getting to a point where now I work in a factory, now all these different things where I don't have to try as hard to maintain food or to maintain these other things. Now the idea is I don't really have to prove myself anymore. I just have to make enough money, and we just now like each other, and so we can go and elope or whatever. With
the rise of feminism, women in the labor force.
Exactly, right? And so you also think about it with the rise of work during that revolution being more easy. That's where feminism comes in. Like, hey, we can do the same jobs that men can do. Well, when you work in a factory, sure, but if you actually have to build your own cottage and raise your own crops and feed your own animals, it's a little bit harder to actually do. And so you think about where we are at today. Now you have those different, things where it's like, now we have this dating where people just come together, they get emotionally involved, generally physically involved, and then they, learn basically how to become involved with one another to become one. And then they learn how to break that apart, which is not like just a separation. When two become one and fall asunder, you're actually shattering something rather than just having it, we're just not doing this anymore. And so dating, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but as Vodi Bakum says, the modern dating teaches us to become serial monogamists. I mean, why do we think the divorce rate is so high? Because we learned that you can get emotionally involved, give yourself to one another, put your things together, and then if you don't like each other, see you later.
Break up.
Yeah, we basically have catechized young people to quit, to fail, and ultimately to essentially try to take all the good blessings that come along with marriage. I mean, before, men used to have to work hard to earn the right to enjoy their bride, right? Now men have zero accountability with the rise of, abortion, birth control, no-fault divorce. I mean, you name it, all of the fruits of egalitarianism and feminism over the past 100 years. All those things have completely removed all responsibility from young men. And so we've basically destroyed it. And honestly, I think that ties in right off the bat with just the concept of our declining birth rates, everything. We've destroyed the family unit, which has always been patriarchal. Sorry if that offends anyone. Not sorry, actually. Right? We've destroyed the family unit, and we've incentivized young people to love debauchery, to love adultery, to love fornication, rather than to love the good things that the Bible actually promotes, which are far more glorious and far more beautiful. And it's to our own shame, frankly. And so I think we in the church have a responsibility to build up and promote what the Bible teaches is good and godly and right for us to build and form our households.
Well, I think that's a key part of a distinction between courtship and dating. Dating is too much like just test driving all the different cars on the lot to see whether or not you really like them, and they're really not. You're really not intending to buy. You're not prepared to buy, if you will, in terms of to receive and to get married. You just kind of hope to run into it run into the right person at the right time. But in the meantime, there's a lot of collateral damage with the breakup culture of dating. So you've got 13-year-olds dating each other in junior high or stuff like that, right? It's kind of just baloney stuff. High schoolers really having no plan or opportunity. And this was one of the sad things actually that was helpful for my children to see, as they play sports at the local high school, and to have a couple of their acquaintances and friends on the sports teams have knocked up some young ladies in the community, and so you've got you have these. So my children are observing the reality that here are these the brokenness of this. Here are these young people, boyfriends and girlfriends, untethered and just dating on their own, and lo and behold, we have little babies being brought into this world by a bunch of teenagers that are unprepared and unmarried and unprepared to be married to one another. Yeah. And so anyway, I think there's this element of there's actually some principles here that are found biblically. You highlighted especially the historical aspect of that, that actually what we are finding in this dating system is a very new and novel way of doing things in the course of history that is not exactly an improvement and is actually wrought with a lot of challenges and problems if we don't understand the tethering, the values and the principles of what we are actually what are men and women supposed to actually be doing. And like Gabe, you were saying, right? We've diminished and demoralized and beat down the concept of family and marriage so far that we then just have all of this test driving going all around.
So it's cheap imitation.
And we're cheapening it to the point where we're actually not pursuing what we're actually supposed to be after.
Well, and not only is it less than, frankly, it's outright rebellion against the nature that God created us to have, right? We have, we'll get to it in a little while, but we have Adam and Eve in the garden, right? So our nature is designed for marriage. And so what we've done is we've, in the same way that Paul talks in Romans 1, that we've exchanged the truth for a lie, that's exactly what we've done with the concept of marriage and dating, is that we've exchanged this glorious truth for this lie that I can have all of the thrill without any of the responsibility or work or commitment. And then what ends up happening is you have a whole bunch of sad single people dying alone. And we've completely destroyed the beauty of it is, marriage is work sometimes. And there is challenges, and you have to actually, be able to provide for your household and do all these challenging things, young men. But guess what? The fruit of what you get in exchange is so much better, so much more glorious. And I think by God's grace, the destruction of our young people has been so wrought the past couple decades that I think even we're seeing now in the secular society a turning away from some of that culture. I mean, there's plenty of podcasts out there that aren't even Christian that will, shame body counts. And I mean, you're talking about you test driving cars. I mean, I don't even want to think about the mileage and how many drivers have used some of these cars, so to speak, right? I mean, it's
and I'm not
absurd.
I'm not talking entirely sexual. I'm just pointing out.
No, just even emotional.
Yeah,
like the fact that people have entwined themselves. You're talking about unity. Our purity is not just sexual and physical. Our purity is also our emotional union, right? Mm-hmm. That I will not give my love to another. That's huge. I mean, women in particular struggle with that, but so do men. I mean, I brought it up in a sermon a couple weeks ago that the concept of work wives and work husbands is just vile. This idea that I'm going to have these affections and this sort of special relationship with someone not my own bride at my workplace, like that's disgusting, and the fact that we tolerate that even in Christendom really reflects how poor our view of marriage is. And so what I hope this podcast will do is encourage young people that there's a better way, and that it's glorious, and that there is a good pursuit that we can aim at. And we as pastors want to help equip you young people and want to actually be able to walk alongside you, especially as we'll get to later. Not every young lady in the church has a father that can actually lead them this way. And I wasn't a father who was trained to do that when I was younger. And we need to train our young men as well to be those sorts of fathers.
Just to add one more thought, maybe before we move on, the fact of the matter is simply this. If you come up to a mountain and you believe that there's gold in the middle of that mountain, you will dig as hard as you possibly can to reach that gold.
Yep.
The problem is that we've been told now there's no gold in the marriage mountain. But the problem is it is there. We should be digging so hard it attracts smog. Okay? That's how hard we should be going. And the fact is we don't believe that anymore. We don't believe there's actually value to marriage and family and all those different things. And so we have diminished that down. We have taken it away. And because of that, because there's no more self-governance and there's no more family governance, it's a literal jungle out there.
Well, so courtship then, as just a basic definition, as you gave, a mediated relationship with the intention of marriage. Maybe put a little bit more around that, if you can help us with that, Luke, and talk to us about this patriarchal family structure and sort of the spheres element to it. We've talked about that in terms of COVID, in terms of the differences of the different governments that God has ordained. How does that play a role in this whole conversation? So would you add to that?
So within the world, the thought is, and this is just to do a quick overview of it, is that there are spheres of sovereignty. So at the center with you, you have self-governance, you have self-control, temperance, things like that. But if you go outside of that self-control, there are three other intersecting spheres that will keep you in place. There's the family, the church, and the state. And they're all represented by particular tools that the Bible gives them. So for the family, it is the rod. For the church, it is the keys. And for the state, it is the sword. Okay? And so wherever you go out of your self-control, you will be either corrected by the rod, the keys, or the sword. And so marriage is a function of the family. It should be a function of families should be creating more families. That's the idea. And then the church and the state should be affirming those things by the church using the function of the keys to bind two together, and then the state using the sword to break apart when necessary to cut apart these things. But marriages should be primarily the function of the family. Families should be creating more families. Yeah. We should be using the rod to teach our children what it means to be a godly husband, what it means to be a godly wife, what it means to be married. And we should be not just teaching them, but we should also be imitating that too. We should also be showing that forth within our own families, right? This is how mom and dad are married, and this is how we are happy, and this is how you can be happy too. And so then courtship then is a part of that where you have the father, which is what patriarchy means, the father rule, where a father has a daughter, and then a son will come to the father and say, I want to marry your daughter, intention of marriage. And then the father says, okay, prove that you can take care of her. Prove that you can that you can lead her. Prove that you can actually be the head of a house. And once you do that, then my daughter will be given to you. You can cleave to her and become one flesh and become a new family.
And I know at least one guy in our church that will make you do a marksmanship and PT exam if you want to marry his daughter. Just throwing out there. So be ready, young men.
Well, there's a little something to that, Gabe, is
Can you defend my daughter?
well, yeah, that's what I'm getting at, is that actually, because there isn't a strict outline, a strict rule for exactly how that's to be done, there's going to be differences in the different patriarchal guidance that's going to be given. So not everything is going to look exactly the same for everyone. It's each father is going to have maybe certain ways, certain nuance to the way in which they want to see. They want to uncover. Because look, a lot of times that young man comes and he's as clean as he's ever been. He's as sharp as he's ever been. He's as impressive as he could possibly try to be. But sometimes you also have the element of, that face is put on and the best foot forward is addressed, but you don't have the ability always to get under the surface. And so sometimes the father comes up with certain elements to say, there's certain things that I want to see you be able to do to identify actually what kind of a man you are.
It's
not the one you
slaying the Philistines, right?
I'll
leave the example there.
Yes. not just simply the it's sort of like the old Leave It to Beaver show. What was it? The neighbor kid?
I'm not.
Eddie Haskell.
Eddie. What was Eddie? A flatterer. Okay. Eddie comes in and he's buttering up Mrs. Cleaver all the time. What a pretty dress you have on. And how are you, Mr. Cleaver, sir? All this. But he was also underneath. There was a lot of mischief, right? He was an instigator. And so a suitor can come in with that flattery and with that good face forward. And yet you want to be able to discern who he really is. And each father is going to have some certain ways to do that.
And by the way, just a more recent popular culture idea. There's a song, maybe you guys are familiar. There's a song called Rude. You guys know have you guys heard of that song?
Never heard of it.
Okay. The song is about a guy who goes to his girlfriend's dad to ask for marriage, and he says no. And the chorus is, "Why you gotta be so rude? I'm gonna marry her anyway."
Ooh.
That's the song.
And that is how murder happens. If you know.
Right. But here's the thing, though. Back to what we're saying. People don't respect the family anymore. You say, because I have these fluttery emotions, I want to marry your daughter. And the dad is saying, fluttery emotions are fine, but who are you?
Substance.
What are you?
Yeah.
Right? And then therefore the culture now was catechized through song. Why do you got to be so rude? Yeah. I'm not being rude. I'm being a dad.
So biblically speaking, this has been a big emphasis of mine. The issue of a father giving his daughter away at the altar actually means something. That's not just cute. It's not just sentimental of a love for a father and a daughter.
It's a transfer of responsibility.
He's actually giving his approval, and he's actually transferring real authority. And so that element where in this song, as you propose it, where this man comes and he is in essence making a demand, and it doesn't matter what you say, I'm going to do, I'm going to take what I want, is a extreme disrespect and an out of order of what God has designed. And God represented this idea himself when he brings the woman to the man, when he brings Eve to the man and gives him his daughter. God gives Adam his own daughter to be his wife. Right. Yeah. And so that's a real thing. It's a real relationship. And so fathers have the ultimate responsibility for the marriage, the giving away of their daughters.
Yeah. And if there's some bristling young ladies listening right now, don't worry, we'll get to it here in a little bit. That doesn't mean that you don't have a say. We're also going to say that we're not proposing, arranged marriages against your will. Right. By all means,
speak for yourself.
Well, dude, okay. I don't know about you guys, but our church, everyone has already. I'm pretty sure we've got families between our churches that have marriages arranged. This is a Christian thing. It's part of the reason why we're bringing it up. I mean, it's people in our church have asked about this topic, And it's because we have so many young families that want to do it better than the way we did it, right, growing up, because we were not catechized.
We want our children to stand on our shoulders, not next to us, trying to figure it out like as if it's the first time.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So that's helpful. And then maybe add a little bit more to that, to the spheres element too. Well, you already did that, I guess, in terms of the tools. But so I think it's very important that you bring up there the issue of the rod, and that sometimes we just think of the rod as just the element of corrective discipline, bringing pain to sin, and that's not necessarily the idea of the rod. And I think you didn't imply that at all. But it's this element. If you picture a father as a shepherd, and he has his shepherd rod, you're going to take the rod and you're going to guide the sheep onto the proper path. Yeah. By so often gentle little taps and using that shepherd's crook to pull them away from error and danger in order that they might be well and healthy. And so it's not about just looking down on everything they do as if it's always going to be wrong if they do anything on their own or anything like that. But it is the element of mediated, right? So you are one who is helping to shepherd and govern the biblical principles to make sure that there is safety, to make sure there is purity, and to make sure that they are pursuing the right things to discern whether or not they're matched. Because just because they're courting, I think this is a key element. Well, I was going to save it for later, but I'm bringing it in now. Just because you're courting doesn't mean that you must get married. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
You can actually have breakups. The issue is going to be the difference between courtship and dating breakups is that you ought to be doing things in such a way that you have not bound yourself emotionally and physically to this other person so that it's so hard to make clear-minded, thoughtful, and principled decisions about not being together, right? So being able to see clearly, and you're not tearing people's hearts apart in doing that. A courtship breakup and a dating breakup should be fairly significantly different because of what you have allowed and not allowed to take place within that relationship, because you have a mediator who's helping to make sure that things are properly ordered and governed.
Well, and how that would look like too is in a church, assuming you have people that stay in the church after they get married, someone who's been broken up in a traditional like worldly dating relationship is probably not going to be very comfortable attending with a former ex, right? Whereas someone where a couple of families, they started the courtship, wasn't really a good fit, they could actually still be in community and share the Lord's Supper together and not be weird, right?
That's a good,
right? Exactly. That's a good example. I think that's a good way of defining between the two.
And back to the rod idea, we do think of the rod as that corrective tool of discipline, but a shepherd has a rod, not just to correct his own sheep and to teach and train them, but if a wolf shows up, he's got to get clubbed.
That's right.
I mean, that is exactly what a rod is for.
There's a threat involved.
And so when families make more families, when fathers affirm marriages and hand off their daughters, they're also handing down the rod to the next generation by saying, you are worthy of this tool, and here is your first sheep, my daughter.
Yeah.
That's the idea. And then you go have more children, and then you use that rod.
Yeah, God willing. And that's a beautiful picture, right? And I think that's really good.
Well, especially when you're talking about the fact that it's not like the wife is, even though she's bearing, whatever young lady marries my boy, right, is going to have my name. But it's not my authority that she's under. She's under my son's authority, right? And so they're forming their own household that bears my name, but it's their own household. And so that idea there of transference of authority is huge, because whatever man, and that's why it's so important for fathers to be on the same page as well, even though we would say fathers of daughters is definitely what we're going to emphasize here. On the same side, when I have my sons, I still have a responsibility to be active in that relationship building with that other father. And so we'll get into it later, but the challenge comes into, I think, for a lot of us in the modern church is that a lot of us don't have sound fathers. And a lot of us, we're here as pastors. Most of us even probably didn't learn this growing up. We didn't have this experience. And so our challenge for you, fathers that are already out there that are trying to think through these things, you have young children, is be the sort of man that can actually be comfortable asserting this sort of authority and shepherding a young man.
Be the father that wrote the book of Proverbs.
There you go.
The Proverbs is where the rod is most mentioned. And it's a father telling his son how to be a man and bear the rod. right? Find a good wife.
Where you find her, and
Exactly.
where you don't find her.
Exactly. Where you find her,
Not in the
where
streets, young
where
man.
you don't find her, how you take care of her. Don't be lazy. Don't be a lout. Don't be a fool. Foolish people get harmed. And if
And
you're
what's
a
the
fool,
culmination of Proverbs,
exactly.
right?
And that's the idea is that that's the kind of father we need to be, the one who would gladly take the book of Proverbs and say, this is what you should be. This is how I'm going to train you, son, so that you can wield the rod properly.
Don't give your strength to just any woman, right? But find that one woman and devote all of your strength to her, right?
I mean, it literally it's the idea of being intoxicated
Right.
by the wife of your youth. What does that mean? How do you get intoxicated? You overindulge in something, right? And that's what you're called to do. You find, whoever finds a wife finds a good thing. And the book of Proverbs is saying, when you find that good thing, get as much of it as possible. Intoxicate yourself with it. Be in a stupor about it.
Drink deeply.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Praise God.
And I think this just highlights the necessity of discipling our young men to be well prepared, to be mature. I think the delayed adolescence or the prolonged adolescence is a problem in our country overall, as a broad culture, but also within the church. And we want to seek to be working towards overcoming that and discipling our young men to be mature and prepared for marriage at the earliest opportunity. Like if you are ready, mature and ready for marriage at 18, God bless you. And if you're ready, if you have found a wife at 18, I was very happy that the first wedding that I did was 2 18-year-olds in our church, right? That's a cool thing. I love young marriages like that. Now, I'm not for young marriages if you're ill-equipped and ill-prepared and immature for such a role. But I think the point is that we want to pursue maturity for our young people earlier in their teen years than late in their 20s when they're finally just barely maybe getting ready or maybe not. And so just that element of disciple making, as Luke talked about, the book of Proverbs, but also, of course, all of Scripture, and other men in their lives, primarily fathers, grandfathers, and other men in the church, elders, and so forth, who are able to then lead these young men to think wisely and to literally prepare their lives to be to pursue this, to value this, right? To value marriage, to value family, and to make sure that their loves are ordered. The order amoris are in the right direction, right? How is it that you love properly, and so as God designed, you want to be prepared for that. So where is courtship described in the Bible?
Yeah, so it's really about an idea, thinking about, does the Bible prescribe and tell us what to do, or does it describe something that we can kind of gather the information and make a judgment call from there, right? It is a description versus a prescription. So to be transparent, there is no explicit or didactic text about courtship, right? I can't go to
court.
Yeah, I cannot go to book and verse and say, okay, how to courtship, how to do courtship. Step 1, this. Step 2, that. It doesn't work that way. So what we do is
nor for dating or any other
Exactly.
form. So at some point we have to acknowledge that this is principally derived, but not a singular, just one-stop shop for everything about how to get married.
Yeah,
right?
we're gonna biblically infer the principle, but the exact practice may look slightly different.
That's right. Exactly.
Right. And so basically we have to look through the narratives and try to see what is called normative, what is the normal way that it seems that marriages and relationships are formed. And I think our confession, the 1689, talks about the idea of that not everything is explicitly written down, but we can use prudence and wisdom and things like that are, as it says, that are common to human actions and societies, which are ordered by the light of nature, and Christian prudence, according to the general rules of the word, are always to be observed. That's chapter 1, paragraph 6. And so the idea is that if this is normative, the Bible says that this ought to be normal, then that's the idea that we can say, okay, this is something that God wants us to really think about, right?
Yeah.
Wants us to actually look at and say, okay, here's how they came together. Maybe this is something that we should try to emulate. And so basically what you do is you take the examples given And then you ask, what is most fitting to what is being narrated here? What is most fitting to what is being described here? And by the way, we do this for a lot of different things.
That's right.
I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was the idea of like the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. There's a principle that we should be doing the Lord's Supper. We should be coming to the Lord's table. Okay. That principle is rock solid everywhere. But you know what's not rock solid?
There's certain key ingredients.
Right.
Yes.
But every church actually seems like there's something a little bit different, but just a little bit unique, or just a lot of little differences that each church is going to practice, right? Mm-hmm. But there's going to be key elements that are going to be the same. For instance, you're going to have the bread and the wine. But there's going to be even nuances there, differences, the way different churches are going to practice. Right. But there's going to be the fundamental meanings and the fundamental principles always need to be present.
And then the question then is, so all of our job then in individual churches as elders is to ask ourselves, so what is the most fitting way to represent this? And good churches, good brothers can disagree over what that might look like, but all of us should be using the word, I think is Luke's point here, to be the standard by which we seek to represent God's word rightly. And so as we look at these narratives and these concepts, I think we can infer, general guiding principles of what is good and what God says is good and what God clearly does not approve of.
Right. Yeah. And that's the best that we have. And so when we just look at these narratives we have, I think we can kind of gather together that courtship was normative within the scriptures. And so the first example, we've already mentioned it, was Adam and Eve. God,
the father of both,
who is, as he has Adam in the garden, Adam is naming the animals, which is a show of dominion, and then sees that there is not a help meet for him or a helper comparable to him, sees that he doesn't have his own match. So then God makes him a bride and then gives that bride to the man.
And he makes Adam very aware of it.
Yes.
Right. He makes Adam very aware of his aloneness. And I think there's an element there too of recognizing he's the father of both. And we find that the father of the groom, of the man, he also may participate and help his son. We've been talking about the responsibility of a father over his daughter, the authority of a father of his daughter. But we find in multiple places in Scripture as well, this being the first one, of course, where the father of a single man is also helping him to find a mate, to find a bride.
He's
cultivating his son to be well prepared. And we find this, of course, with Abraham saying, go to this place and do this and follow these instructions in order to help my son get married. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a kind of a cool element to recognize right there from the start.
And I also think about it too, like you think about it as well when, Adam sees Eve. And as the old joke is, he says, "Whoa, man!" And so she's woman now, right? But the whole point is that he says, "Man shall leave father and mother, cleave to his wife." So Adam is here with God, naming the animals, and now he's leaving the immediate presence of God, which is why God has to come find them, to be with his wife and take dominion. Right? You're cleaving to your wife, go into the world now and have dominion. And I think just all that picture this is a courtship model that is in the creation model.
Well, and it should be. I think what we're going to argue for the rest of this discussion is that this should be what we are telling our children is the normative method and the way that we're going to act. I mean, my boys have known since they were little, I told them, you don't develop affections or pursue a girl until you're in a position to put a ring on her finger. That's my standard for you. And so when you're in a position where you're like, I can go talk to her father and put a ring on her finger, then you're allowed to start, pursuing.
What age is that?
Yeah. Whenever they're prepared, right?
Exactly, right?
And that might look different. And so that's the conversation, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but my oldest, for example, is very intentionally thinking about how he can build a business, be in a position because he wants to get married young. And so he's thinking intentionally about how can I be prepared to do these things so that if the right young lady comes along, that he's ready. That means that, we have to start catechizing that before he's 17, because at 17, it's already kind of too late to start teaching that principle. So he's known that since he was 8, 9, 10 years old. We've talked about it for a decade almost at this point. And so we have a responsibility with our sons to teach them this is what they ought to be pursuing, to build something, to take dominion, so that not only a bride would be attracted to him, because that's attractive, right? But also so that that bride's father is going to be much more willing to approve of his pursuit of their daughter.
A good father.
A good father.
Right. Yeah.
And you already brought it up. So the next example would be Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham sought a bride for his son, and he sent a servant with parameters for a bride, but not necessarily like a name. So this is not an arranged marriage. This isn't, hey, go find so-and-so and bring her back. Okay, it is go to these people because we can't marry Canaanites because we're trying to inherit the land, not be absorbed into it. So go find this person in this family, and then that's what the servant goes and does.
Translation, you are only allowed to marry Christians.
So if your daughter comes home with a Mohammedan, I'll just leave the quote there.
Well, the rod is for clubbing the wool. Amen. Anyways.
And this video just got taken down. Moving on.
But the whole point is that what we're seeing here is that then that servant goes and deals with Rebecca's brother. There is a mediation that happens. That the servant brings proof of the fact Isaac can take care of her. Won't send Isaac because it's Abraham's only son, so he's not going to go send it into the wild. So go find it, bring her back. She actually agrees to it, which is a really important
heir,
point.
so there's certainly an attractiveness to what his inheritance would be, and those types of things.
And so then she agrees. So first she shows that she is of good character, and then the servant says, "Hey, let's go talk to your whoever's involved.
Your
go
father,
talk to whoever's
originally
involved." And then she agrees and says, "Yes, this is good." So the dowry is paid. Rebecca goes back to Isaac, and they get married. And so it's just that mediated kind of, I'm proving I can take care of her, and then this family is handing her off.
And interestingly, there's observations that we can make as well, where we recognize that it doesn't always go according to plan, or it doesn't always go with the most wisdom of the ones that are put in charge. So in that particular example, I looked at this as earlier today, and I've looked at it before, where you've got you go back to Rebecca's father. So they go back to her home and where her father is, but then you've got Laban and the girl's mom, who actually end up being the ones who are trying to be a little bit difficult. They seem to have a measure of say, and they're sort of trying to put some speed bumps. Laban's not a great character, so we'll just put it that way. And so we see him because he comes up later, of course. But we have issues here where the brother and the mom get involved as well. And in that situation, we also see that it's actually trying to make trouble in the situation, which isn't great. We don't actually see the father's involvement, but what we do see, you already mentioned it, but I just want to put a highlighter on that particular element, and that is the fact that Rebecca was consulted. What do you say? Are you willing to go? Right? Are you willing to go? And so back to where you were already taking this earlier, Gabe, is the issue of this is not a one wherein the young woman is just a passive party in this process, wherein she just is a doormat and has to do whatever these evil patriarchs have to tell her to do. The reality is that in this situation, she is actually consulted, and she says, "I am willing," and which also identifies that if she denied that, then that we would be hearing a little different part of the story, or she might not have entered the story at all if she wasn't willing. And so in that element, we recognize that the girl does have a say and should have a say in this, and so she is working in consort with the mediator, most often a father, but not necessarily if there's other extenuating circumstances. And so in this, we don't know exactly the situation, but perhaps Laban is the one. He's clearly a strong personality and perhaps the heir in this particular case. You have here a brother is standing in and taking some measure of speaking role on behalf of Rebecca. So the point just being, I want to just highlight here that the young woman should be involved in that, and also she's working in consort where the father actually is able to defend her, because it can be very difficult if she's not actually interested in a young man who's interested in her, that she can communicate to her father, "I'm actually not interested. I don't like him for whatever reason may be.
That's actually a gift to her.
That's a gift to her. And so then she can just simply say to the father, which is much more difficult for her to say to a young man who is flattering and who is pursuing perhaps with a measure of fervency. And the father can be, hit the bricks, pal. You don't bother, you don't get to pass go, don't get to collect $200.
Yeah.
This is where this ends, and move along.
Well, and the challenge for us. Okay. I was just going to say the challenge for us as men is that in the same way that I encourage the men of our church, your wives are called to submit to you, whether you're worthy or not. But you should strive to make that submission a joy and not a burden, right? In the same way, if we're raising our daughters well, our daughters should delight in our protection, our counsel, our guidance. We should be raising our daughters in such a way that if we're training them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, that they're going to want daddy's idea.
They have a lot of trust.
They're going to trust us as fathers. And so that puts the onus on us to train up our daughters, raise our daughters well. And that also puts a lot of responsibility on our wives to model that for them, as that trust and respect within the household. And when we do that well,
to support their husbands,
exactly,
in the eyes of their daughters.
Because if the wife is working to undermine the father's authority constantly, it's going to train the daughter that, well, dad actually doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So we need to build a household of mutual respect.
And trains her for marriage and all those types of things as well.
Yep.
And just what I was going to say is that it's easier for me as a father to tell a son get lost than it is for my daughter to do so as well. And as far as training, I mean, that's, when we think about father rule, being the head of the house, I mean, it's even a protection for like our wives and stuff, where it's like, I know many times where it's been like, somebody, my wife wants to say no, but doesn't always have the best way to do it. She can always use me, right?
Yep.
Because if it's no, she can just say, well, my husband says no.
Even just committing to an engagement or something. Yeah, or like an event. Yep.
And if someone asks my wife, is your husband sure? You can just call him up and I'll just say no, because that's what I said, right? I mean, I don't mind taking on that blame, that kind of a thing, to just be the one who says, yep, this isn't going to work. See you later.
Well, in Old Testament law, you even have that example of if a wife gives her word, like commitment to do something, and the husband actually vetoes it, he has the authority to essentially say her word doesn't stand because I'm going to trump it. But if he says nothing, then he's bound by her word. In the same way, we actually can bless our wives. There's been times where my wife's like, oh, I've been asked to do all these different things, and I just really, I don't think it's the best use, but I
let me help you.
Yeah, and I was like, I got you, right? And I'll step in and I'm like, hey, I don't want you doing that. And then my wife can simply say, hey, my husband said that I have to do this other thing, and it's a gift to her. Yeah. Because let's just be frank, women are not designed to be confrontational.
The bad guys all the time.
Yeah. But we are, right? Like, in fact, we need to be careful not to enjoy it too much sometimes. And so we actually can bless our wives and daughters by protecting them and saying, you don't have to say no. I'll do it for you with joy.
Right. Yeah. So moving on, the next example I have is Jacob and Laban again. And just once again, we just see Jacob leaves his house.
Can you imagine having Laban as a father-in-law?
He goes and finds
far
Laban.
Away.
And basically Jacob sees Rachel and says, ooh la la, what do I need to do? Laban says, 7 years of work. Okay, 7 years of work. Basically, one of the most romantic verses, followed by one of the most unromantic verses followed. And then, so we know that Laban obviously tricks Jacob and things like that. But the whole point is we're just seeing once again that Jacob went, and once he went there, he talked to Laban. What do I got to do to earn your daughter?
Well, Laban had actual authority because Jacob respected it.
And he was the father. And so in that particular way, he did have the keys in this particular sense. And so, he did have to decide whether or not it was worth it. And if it wasn't, then he could have moved along. He didn't have to abide by it. Some fathers can be unreasonable, and that we don't recommend that, right? Fathers should be reasonable. Fathers should not be seeking to place just unreasonable, heavy burdens. I think there's value in having strict fathers, having fathers who do seek to get to the bottom of whether or not he's going to be suitable for taking the reins for my daughter, because she's precious, because she's been cared for, she's been discipled, she's been just precious as a person in this household, to loved by a father. And we don't just give her away for nothing. We don't give her away for free. There should be something clear that we get. But at times, I think fathers might be overbearing and unreasonable as well, and so we want to guard against both ditches. But here, Laban, he's a shyster, and he's in it for, it seems to be, he's in it far more for himself, and he's willing. And see, part of that story is that Jacob is a faithful worker and he's blessed by God, and so Laban sees all the advantages that he gets from Jacob's labor. That's a good husband to his daughter, right? So he's demonstrated his worth, but he's so selfish and he's so conniving that he's going to then trick him and still hope that he gets another 7 years out of it. And it's a terrible story on one level, but getting back to why you brought this up, it's that issue of, but he is the father, he does have rights, and if the son wants to have that daughter, he has to submit to the father of the bride in that particular case. And if you don't want to sign up for that, then you have to move along. But he does have the right to determine the terms for how to marry his daughter.
Absolutely. And you think about it, like when Jacob first shows up, what does he have? He actually has nothing. So in one sense, Laban saying, well, work for me for 7 years is not a strange thing, because you just showed up out of nowhere. You claim to be related to us. You have nothing. I know Isaac's rich, right? So what's going on? Okay, why don't you work and prove you actually can actually build something?
He might
and then
have the birthright at that point, but either way, that's still along in the future. What are you gonna do for her now? Right?
Exactly, right? And so now, as you said, once he sees that Jacob is blessed by God, all of a sudden it's like, well, this is kind of nice. How do I get more out of this, right? So it is interesting how like a good thing turned into a bad thing, right? It probably wasn't an unreasonable thing for Laban to say that. But then when it's like, oh, this Jacob guy is actually really good, how do I keep him around for a while? Well, then you know the rest of the story.
And so once again, just to put another point on it, beware, fathers, of being unreasonable and selfish in your conniving, to where you're actually not caring for the young man and your daughter, but you're really caring for yourself. So whether that's trying to keep your daughter, right? Yeah. Trying to keep your daughter at home and not let her get married, or those types of things where no one is good enough for your daughter. Beware of those types of things. Beware of being a Laban. You know, I've seen that before. I've seen Labans who are just unreasonable, and they're really haven't thought things through. And so that's where sometimes the challenge of courtship can be, and where people can feel like they're disappointed with the process if you're dealing with people that are less mature, who don't know exactly how to do this well, and who are unreasonable. And sometimes, as a young man, you have to be discerning and figure out what the right thing to do is. Sometimes it might be you have to deal with the demands of a Laban and go through it. Sometimes it's, you know what, we need to move along here and pursue somewhere else. Those are things we wouldn't dare to decide for you. But the reality is those guys are out there. So men, if you're listening, don't be a Laban.
Exactly. And also just the idea too that this is a stat that I heard. So it was the stat that 51% of marriages end in divorce, right? And then of that 51% that end in divorce, 51% of them end because of in-laws. And so men, understand that you have a choice. If you approach a father and he is unreasonable, you can also say no. Say, you know what?
That's right.
This guy is over the top, and maybe just let him know you're being over the top. You know, you're not going to get your daughter married off, but I'm not going to deal with you because there's a 51% chance that if I follow through with this guy or this mother-in-law is going to wreck our marriage.
No, and there's something to that. We could probably, let's see, do we want to go down that road? Probably not. But there are
not
some,
tonight.
Not tonight. But it is a very important thing. No, I will go down this road just briefly. All right, I'm gonna just take
the pastor just said he's going to take a rabbit trail briefly.
I'm gonna take
the record.
I'm gonna take the lid off.
Okay. And then stopwatches start now.
And then I'm gonna walk away. And that's the importance of recognizing, because actually Luke brought it up. When you marry, you are marrying families.
Ooh.
So you do have to care about the in-laws. Now, you do have to care about the in-laws on several fronts, right? One, because this is the environment in which your bride or your bridegroom has been raised in. And there is no getting around the fact that there is influence there. Now, sometimes the influence is, I don't want to be like my parents.
Yeah.
right? Because I see certain or in some degree, right? There's a spectrum there. Sometimes it's this in this one area, or sometimes it's in every area. My parents were terrible parents, or whatever else. But there's values there that and there's ways of operating within a marriage that have been caught, and some of them have been taught. And so you do have to work through those elements. And so another aspect of pursuing marriage, not just pursuing the marriage of a Christian woman, which speaking about from a man's perspective, of course, because they both have to be Christians, but also there is value in looking at her family. Are her family Christian, or is she a first-generation Christian? I'm not saying don't marry a first-generation Christian, but just recognize that there are factors that do come into play when you marry someone, and their family, the in-laws, do matter. And the fact of the matter is, we have a church discipline case where it is highly influenced by the in-laws that have actually drawn a wedge between in this particular marriage, and has caused significant damage. That statistic, whether or not it's 100% accurate, I certainly couldn't say, but it in terms of what we are dealing with in one respect in our church, it's 100% accurate, and that was the genesis of the splitting up of a marriage. And so we just have to be wise to it. Look, you can't control everything. Don't black pill on marriage because it's too hard and there's too many risks. The issue though is that in-laws, background, family, these things do matter, and so you have to weigh them and recognize what you're signing up for, whatever you're doing.
Well, it's also just a matter of that's not to say that you can't commit to overcome some of those challenges, right?
Correct.
So case in point, if my daughter is enraptured by some young man and I see deficiencies in him, but he's willing to be discipled, and I'm willing, for love of my daughter, who is taken with this young man, to invest and disciple in him, if I choose to do that, that's obviously on my prerogative. But obviously that would be something that I would be very careful to discuss with my daughter and say, look, I'm willing to go down this route, but here's what I'm seeing. And if I don't see change in that I know you're excited about this, but I'm going to just be upfront with my daughter. But
we haven't found the right guy, but we might be able to make him.
Well, you don't. I mean,
that is the last chapter of Vodi Baca's book.
Yeah.
Right.
If you can't find one, build one.
Yeah,
build one.
Exactly. So I mean, there is something to say about, for example, you could have someone who comes from a very different background. Maybe they're from a different country. Like you have cultures and other things. There's wisdom in trying to decide whether or not it's wise to pursue a marriage in those circumstances. But that doesn't mean that you can't overcome it. It's a matter of preparing yourself. Case in point, I had to recognize that I came from a divorced household. My wife was from a stable household. We had very different upbringings. And there was fruit from that in the first couple of years of our marriage, just in the way that we had learned to interact with, conflict, whatever it may be. There's just things that you have to be prepared for. And as fathers, we can help prepare that. Prepare our children for those challenges.
You have to at least realize those things. It doesn't mean that they are deal breakers.
Yeah.
But there also should be some measure. I think there should be some measure, especially early on, of a bit more idealism.
Yeah.
I do think there is value in pursuing, like.
Are you saying set the standard high?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because I love my children.
Look, I do think it is preferable for my son to marry a woman who comes from a Christian intact household, and if that should be a measure of attraction to him, would be the point.
Ideally from your own church, right? That'd be pretty awesome.
That would be fantastic. So yes, there's ideals there. Now the reality is that we don't always have the opportunity for the ideal. I think you should shoot for the ideal, but there is an element of so you just your own self, Gabe, like you said. Okay, so can some people get kind of emotional about it where, oh, you mean you wouldn't marry me because I didn't come from because my parents were divorced and that sort of thing. It's like, no. It doesn't mean that this marriage is.
I had to work harder to prove it to my wife's father. I'll just put it that way.
For sure.
It was probably 3 years into the marriage, I think, before I finally earned his respect.
The point is that there's that God is gracious and he is kind and he can work through any broken situation, but that doesn't change the idea. And we talked about this briefly before the podcast, right? God can be very gracious to take a let's say a young man who is raised entirely in government schools, and he can actually make him a faithful Christian man who has a God-glorifying marriage. He's successful and smart in life. And I would still tell you, don't send your kids to public school. But just because you went to public school doesn't mean that it's a broken, lost cause. But God is gracious to take imperfect, same thing with marriages, right? You might not have followed the courtship model, but God can be gracious to take things that were entered into poorly, we're not following all the principles. Doesn't mean you failed if you did it differently necessarily. But the bottom line is that God can take things that are not, that we don't do in an ideal fashion, and he can make something beautiful out of it, but it doesn't undermine or destroy the rule, or it doesn't destroy the ideal. And so we should be pursuing as much of the ideal as we can, recognizing that not everything in life, because it's broken and full of sin, is not everything is going to be ideal. And so we then revert back to the fundamental principle of you must be marrying a Christian. That's the baseline. And there's other elements that do matter, but they don't matter the same as that one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's something, I've been fond of saying for years in ministry, is that we have a habit in the church and in the world broadly, just as humans, to always make the exception the rule. Because an exception exists, we're going to go down to the lowest common denominator. We talked about that when we talked about education. Because a single mom exists, therefore we have to encourage public school. No, that's stupid. She's the exception. Let's try to find a solution to serve her rather than to make her experience normative for everyone, right? Like this is backwards. In the same way, you may have people that come from broken homes. You may have people that have these those are the exceptions. Let's see what the solution for that might be as far as discipleship. It makes me think of like how was Josiah in his father's household? You look at, and how did his sons go backwards? I don't know. It's interesting when you read through Kings and Chronicles, how you can have these godly men have terrible sons, and you can have these terrible kings have godly sons. And you look at that, and I think the key difference is when Josiah is actually confronted with the truth. He's quick to repent and quick to believe the truth. And so when you have a young man who is a professing believer, and when you confront him with hey, you're a lazy bum, you need to get your act together, and he does something, he shows the fruit of repentance, that's going to speak to me a lot more, perhaps even than the guy who's clean cut, who looks like the Leave It to Beaver guy, who has it all put together. The guy who's actually going to willingly say, you know what, I'm going to receive your rebuke, I'm going to take your challenge, I'm going to do something about it, he's going to earn my respect pretty quick as a father. And so I think we need to recognize that there's a lot of Josiahs out there that just need the law in their life, and they'll turn it around.
That's very well said. I appreciate that, and that's really good.
Yeah, so I think just so we don't necessarily have to keep going on it. So basically, the other two examples I have, you can look up later. Moses, when he leaves Egypt, he helps some shepherds come and they're pestering a family. He gets them away, and then that father gives his daughter as a thank you, like, "Oh, you will help our family. I'll let you have my daughter." And then David and Saul, David had to prove to Saul to get his daughter, Michal.
Foreskins.
Yeah. And so the other thing too is that there are the regulations within the law. There are references to a bride price. And the point that you see here is that there's this term bride price that obviously the Israelites understood. Why? Because there was a courtship model in place that was the normative thing. And so we think about in the New Testament, we do have at least one showing of a relationship forming, and that is Joseph and Mary. Mm-hmm. They were betrothed together, and what's interesting is that obviously that betrothal would have been a courtship model where now they've agreed to be married, and Joseph is preparing a place for Mary, which is when she's found with child. It's actually kind of an interesting point. You pointed out, Gabe, right before the podcast, but it's the idea that Mary was actually protected being a virgin because of this model, of this betrothal model.
Yeah, if she wasn't betrothed, there would have been severe penalties for her being pregnant. Whereas because she's within a betrothal, in God's law, there is actually implications where he can put her away quietly. Those sort of protections weren't, normative if it was simply that they were fornicating, right?
Yeah. And so it's just an interesting idea where, Joseph was able to take Mary out to Bethlehem because basically in some sense he was the husband now, right?
Well, so
she belongs to me.
Yeah, the way I've explained it, and I think it's helpful. But betrothal is a little bit stronger than our common day engagement. Okay, betrothal was actually legal marriage. So if you actually split from a betrothal, then you actually were divorced. You actually had to give a certificate of divorce, and you would send them out. So betrothal was legal marriage, and then once you actually, then you have official marriage, right? You have the consummation and the coming together under one household. So in this particular betrothal, they're separated, and we could call it engaged, but just recognizing we're dealing with this different cultural context and a little bit different concept. But the idea is that they're actually legally married.
Yeah, it's binding.
It's binding. So you don't just walk away from this. You don't just break up, right? So you're going to do so if you have just cause to do so. You can't, and you wouldn't just be allowed to break up for no reason. You're going to have to really demonstrate that. But also during that period of time, you were actually testing purity, right? You were actually dealing with the test of purity to make sure that there is virginity and so forth. And so that's just an element there of just highlighting the seriousness with which the Jews took this arrangement between two people, was that they officially, or excuse me, officially, they legally bound them together by betrothal, and then you have this waiting period up to about a year, and then he would officially come and take his bride, and they would be united together.
Yeah, and with that comes essentially the assumption, again, that there is an authority, right? When they're being betrothed, it's being recognized by the families and by the church or the synagogue in that case.
Which then also was the civil realm as well.
Right, exactly. And so, again, we see engagement with the various institutions that God has given us, biblically speaking, and within nature. And so when we have the families agreeing to the betrothal, we have now the church recognizing the future household to be established. And in our day and age, who's the one that's going to enforce should the husband violate the principles of that marriage? Who has the one to actually bear penalties? If he were to, commit adultery and go rape another woman, the civil sphere would have the authority and the obligation to bear the sword against him to show honor to the wife that he harmed by committing those crimes. And so we see that God has rightly ordered these things for the protection of our brides.
So since you circled back there, I want to come back there as well. This issue of, if you guys can stop me if we already covered this, but what Luke mentioned earlier, the concept of the rod and the keys and the sword, the different tools of each sphere of authority. When it comes to a lot of modern day stuff that's going on within the church, among Christians, and this issue of getting married, there is a diminishing today of the usefulness and the value of the keys of the use of the church. Look, we'll just call cousin Bob, and he'll meet us at the beach somewhere, and we'll just go ahead and get married. And the church has nothing to do with it. Pastors don't have anything to do. Pastors aren't really needed or necessarily consulted. And yet there is an element wherein I think we need to get back to the concept of the religious nature of marriage, that it is under God and that it does involve the blessing and the union. You mentioned this before the podcast as well, Gabe. The podcast before the podcast is always great, right?
Yeah, hit record earlier.
I know. and that element of that when you get married, it is the formation of a new family, and assume for a moment that family is coming into the church. All the more reason why the church should be involved and the elders should be involved. And one of the key aspects that I wanted to circle back to is this element of the pastoral oversight. So while the families are supposed to be shepherding in the best way that they can, and are there to be guiding these young people into purity and into or towards marriage, when the church is involved, we ought to be testing as well the propriety. That's my word. The propriety of this union. So, for instance, if a couple is determined to be unequally yoked, regardless of if the parents say that this is what they want to take place, it's actually the responsibility of the elders to say, you are not going to be allowed to be married.
We can in good faith
and in good standing in this church, because that is not what. So if someone cannot communicate a testimony of saving faith, a credible profession of faith, then they're not allowed to be unequally yoked to one who does. And so there is an element there where there is a check, there is a balance to that. And similarly, in some measure tradition, it may be overstepped in different cases, but in some measure,
sacramentalism of Rome, and then we've pendulum swung all the way away from sacramentalism.
there's that. And then the other sphere of the civil authority, wherein there is legitimacy for perhaps, I think there's some arguments that could be made, and I'd be interested in hearing them. But
Do you want a piece of paper from Idaho saying you're allowed to be married?
no, well, I do think that there is. I think it is appropriate, not because they decide it's not because they are the ones who create marriages.
Right.
I do think marriage is a civil institution, though, and so I do think that
For tax purposes.
no, well,
No, I'm just teasing.
regardless of what tax purpose is, but because it is civilly recognized, you actually need to identify who's together and who's not.
Right.
And when it comes to identifying marriages and children and responsibilities in the civil sphere, if you're going to have a sword, for instance, in the dividing of that relationship, there needs to be clarity that there was a binding covenant that was entered into.
Correct.
So I argue that similarly that it is to be recognized. Now they might have a stake to say you are not. We're going to use the sword here to keep you from being married because you can't marry your sister. You can't marry your first cousin or whatever the proper legal, in terms of even biblical concept is there, that you're not allowed to be marrying within the family in that way. Yeah. There is, I think, a proper way for the sword to identify those illegal marriages. Or look, I think it's proper for the state to say two men cannot get married.
Amen.
That's actually a civil element there, as well as a religious.
It's the second use of the law. It's the restraining of evil.
100%.
Yeah, and that's an appropriate use of their authority.
So I don't have a problem with getting a marriage license, but it doesn't mean I tease people that I perform their marriages for, and I say, you know what, we lost the marriage license, and so you're not officially married. As they come back from their honeymoon or something. No, that's not the case, right? No. Even if the marriage certificate is lost or whatever else, that they didn't mean the civil authority doesn't accomplish the marriage on your behalf, right?
They merely affirm the marriage that you are declaring. So when
you declare to the state that we've done this.
Exactly. So I'll say, by the power vested in me by God Almighty and as witnessed here amongst, but I don't necessarily, we're not obligated to say by the power of the state of Idaho. However, what we are doing by signing that is we are attesting as religious authority, bearing the keys, if you will, we're attesting to the state that this is a legitimate marriage. And in fact, I think there's something to be said about us elevating the concept and the institution of marriage back to a point where we as the church are conducting legitimacy to it. When we're discipling the state as to what a legitimate marriage is, that shows a place of honor for God's word in describing marriage.
But that's why what's going on with the state, you used to have to demonstrate some measure of ordination.
Correct.
Where you needed to be an actual minister of the gospel in order to be one authorized to perform a marriage,
or at least print off a fake certificate.
If we make America a Christian nation again, it can't just be your blue-haired friend.
Correct.
It can't just be it can't just be your dad.
The Unitarian.
It can't just be your cousin. It's not just any random person who you happen to like who doesn't actually have to be checked by the church.
That's a recent thing because frankly, the very first wedding I ever performed 20 years ago almost now. It was like a whole to-do because I wasn't formally ordained yet, and we had to jump through some hoops and do some different things. And then it was a recent statute change, and so the very first wedding I ever performed, actually, I performed almost the whole ceremony except for the actual declaration. And the actual ordained elder performed the actual declaration portion at the end after the vows, and he was the one who signed it. So it was sort of like a whole to-do, and that was 20 years ago. Now it's commonplace; anyone can sign it. It's just a witness. It doesn't matter. And so this is actually, again,
you can be a fake ordained minister and go ahead and perform marriage.
At least 20 years ago, people were telling me, well, you can go online, you can print this thing off, and I'm like, what's online? No, okay, I'm not that old, but close. But at least, even since I was in college, there has been a shift culturally. in the past 20, 25 years that has been absolutely destructive.
As the state is more secularized, they don't care
Correct.
who's performing the marriages, and they're going to be the ones that just send us your stuff. It no longer matters. So even though there's probably, I haven't looked at it, but there's probably some measure of statutory requirement for a minister,
But it's a
they've just
winking of the
watered
eye.
it down now. Yeah, now it's just a wave of the hand. That doesn't matter. We really don't care. And the problem is that the law is a tutor. The problem is that actually still rings true in the lives of most Americans, but sadly, I think also a lot of Christians. And so we actually have to get back to making marriages and weddings great again by pastors and churches leading and teaching and calling people to value the participation and the inclusion of pastors and churches in the marriages of their children.
Well, there was a time where even the non-Christians
Yes.
would go to a pastor and go to a church to get married.
And if it
because
wasn't a pastor, you had one other option. It was the judge.
Exactly. And it wasn't a real marriage in the eyes of Americans 50 years ago, 40 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago, if you didn't go and have a pastor officiate. And so obviously that brings up questions about pastoral counsel as far as equally yoked. But if you have two unbelievers, like I'm not going to marry two believers, but if I have two unbelievers, that's a different conversation we can talk through about the wisdom there. But at least there was some sort of catechesis happening in society that marriage was a Christian institution. And we need to get back to that.
We need to get back to that. Yeah. So that's just an important part. I think it was good to circle back to that to recognize there is a role to play for the elders of a church and for families to join with the church and to include the state. I do think that those spheres, there's an overlap, but there is I think it's very important to keep those functions separate with your particular tools, but the tools matter.
Well, and also, respecting. So it's not like we're saying as pastors that if two fathers come and say their kids want to get married, that we have somehow trumping authority just of our own prerogative. What we're saying is that if we can see clearly that there is unequally yoked or there's some other sin that needs to be dealt with first,
That's right.
that we have an obligation before Almighty God as ministers of the gospel to rightly declare that to both the fathers and to the participating couple and say, look, this needs to be dealt with before I can actually marry you. Otherwise, if you go out and pursue this outside of the church, you'd be under church discipline. Like you're not welcome in the church if you pursue your
You're going to
marriage.
rebel against your leaders that way.
Exactly. And that's actually an opportunity to teach again. So we want to be careful of saying that because there is an abuse of this sometimes. There are some churches out there that will undermine fathers and husbands' authorities and say that you need to defer to the elder in certain instances that can actually be unhealthy. And so we're not trying to teach that. We're rather saying that our job is to shepherd. And so part of our responsibility as a shepherd is to instruct and to beat away false doctrine when we see it.
Yeah. Well, those are the descriptions in the scriptures. But I think a stronger argument for why we should pursue courtship is the idea that courtship is a Christian idea, as we've been referring to here. In fact, I think as marriage is a picture of the gospel, so courtship is also a picture of the gospel too. Jesus came down, he earned his bride, now he's preparing a place for that bride.
He pursued a bride, not a girlfriend.
Yeah.
Yes. A bride.
Jesus is not our boyfriend.
Well, it was a pursuit of a bride. It wasn't a pursuit of a side piece.
Slay the dragon.
It wasn't a
get the girl.
pursuit of a good time. Right?
Yeah.
Shoot.
And by the way, that's why when we think about the definition of a courtship, that's why that intention of marriage is so important.
That's right.
Right? We're not just letting our children do whatever. We're saying, no, if you're going to come to me for my daughter, your intention has to be marriage.
Yep.
It can't be for any other reason. That's exactly what Jesus did. He came intending to purchase his bride to be married, not to fiddle around and do this other stuff. There is a goal. He set his head like a flint toward that goal, and he went and pursued it.
And he paid a much higher price than David did, that's for sure. So.
Yeah. And so once again, we can say it's not necessarily a one-to-one, but it is very similar. So like, this is why there's so much marriage language within the Gospels, right? So like when Jesus says that no man knows but the Father when he will come, it's not a reference that says that Jesus doesn't know, but that's an idiom referring to marriage. Okay. I have purchased my bride. Now I prepare a place and the Father will tell me to go get my bride.
So the church right now is betrothed to Christ. We are not officially married,
yeah.
but we are legally married. We are legally married, and we've been given the assurance of the Holy Spirit, right? As an engagement, as a down payment, the token of the fact that
it's the engagement
he will be back to actually claim and bring home under his roof his bride.
Well, and how's that described? The wedding feast of the Lamb.
100%. 100%. So we are legally married to Christ, but we are betrothed. It has not been consummated in terms of coming under his roof and in his presence, right? In that way. But all that language and all that process has taken place in terms of the pursuit of the bride, the paying the bride price, and being accepted by the Father, right? He is a suitable suitor. He is a suitable bridegroom who is worthy. He demonstrated his worthiness to be married to the church, to have the bride, and so that's why all this language is corresponding to redemption.
Well, in the preparation, you said this earlier, Luke, before the podcast, like the analogous, I guess, comparison there of him preparing a room for us is that the idea there in that culture was that they'd be adding on rooms to their father's home, right? So expand on that, because that was really helpful earlier.
Yeah, so when Jesus says that in my Father's house there are many mansions or many rooms, that's a reference to the fact that when you had a family, you would add on to the house as more people came in. And so what would happen is you would find a bride, you would prove that you can take care of her. And once that legal contract happens, you go back to your father's house, you would add on to his house to make it bigger. And then once that was done, you would go get your bride. And that's the idea and that's exactly what Jesus says. I will come back for you. And that's what he's telling his disciples. I will not leave you. You will not be like orphans. You will be brought into my Father's house.
So you heard it here. Luke is encouraging all of us to buy acreage and build family compounds. Let's go. I'm actually half serious.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds like a great plan. Let's go.
Not the worst of all ideas.
No laugh track. Just...
Yeah, no, actually do that, friends. Especially in this economy with the cost of land, I think that's a viable option for us as Christians.
Right. And so basically, this is kind of what I would say is more the strongest argument that shows that it is a Christian idea, it is Christian wisdom to pursue courtship. And I think it's because Christ himself did that. And if we are to think that marriage is an example of Christ and his church, well, so is Christ's life as an example of courtship.
Well, another way of saying that is, let's be good Calvinists, right? Did Jesus come with the intention that, maybe it wouldn't work out with the bride, right? Or was he committed from the beginning, right? He was committed to pursue his end. And then as you said earlier, right, he set his face towards it. That's important.
Let's do a little limited atonement as well.
Okay.
He
knew the name.
He did not pay the bride price for everyone who has ever and will ever live, but instead he purchased the very bride for whom he planned to take home to himself. He did not pay for you don't pay a bride price for women that you don't intend to marry. You don't pay the bride price willy-nilly and just spread your wealth around thinly. The reality is that you purchase what you plan to marry. And it's very specific in that way.
Keep the analogy going. Unconditional election, right? He placed his favor upon his bride, not because of necessarily anything lovely within her in of itself, right? Because he found her and he declared her to be lovely and he placed his love upon her. And, we can go into some Calvinist pickup lines here, and, maybe her name was Grace because she's irresistible.
So the Calvinist dating advice will be the next episode, right?
Dude, I think we're going to do that now. Let's go. No, I'm just going to quote Calvin. Perseverance of the saints is what happens after the rings are on.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's the idea that Christ didn't pay a bride price and then just leave the doors open for whoever wants to be a bride, right? It's there was a particular intention that he wanted to do, and that's exactly why. Like I said, this is a Christian idea. We're not just making this up and saying, "Oh, this is what people used to do, so let's just go back to what people used to do."
Well,
there actually is a Christian idea behind this.
Yeah, and speaking to that, I mean, we can look at other cultures that embodied very similar traditions, right? So if you look at the ancient world, outside of Christendom and the Judaic, people, you do see some similarities. But again, why is that? Well, they were derived from the same man, Adam, and there was not everything was lost in the fall, right? There was certain things that have become more and more degraded as God gave us over to a debased mind. So even when you do see other cultures pointing to similar styles, it was actually because of the revealed law of God within nature that was normative for them. And in fact, when you look at societies that did not follow this sort of biblical courtship model, those were typically societies that were associated with debauchery. Think of places like Rome and Greece and places that were full of hedonism and whatnot. Cultures that did not follow more of a normative father rule patriarchy concept were self-destructive. And so ultimately, when we look at our own nation, we're seeing ourselves now starting to look more like those self-destructive societies than what God had intended from the beginning. So again, this whole concept of this topic is to recapture the beauty of the biblical principles because it actually gives life, right? Like we're promoting this not just because it's right, but because it's good. And that's what makes it so glorious.
Yeah, that's the thing is God's ways are always good for us, right? And so we need to make sure that we're seeking to align our desires and our ways to His. We're aligning ourselves to what the principles of Scripture outline for us, not simply our own imaginations. And every time man just comes up with his own ideas out of his own imaginations, usually they don't turn out so well.
And can any of you guys imagine being a 40-year-old man that looks like me in the dating pool? I'm glad I got married at 19. I'm just putting it out there.
You do have a face for radio.
Yeah, there we go.
Well, at least the pool would be a kiddie pool, right?
Oh, never mind.
All right, moving
I'm
on.
not going to tell that. Moving on. So the gospel in marriage,
So,
amen.
by the way, why is courtship better than dating, by the way?
Because dating is stupid. Straight
Yeah,
up.
so anyways, there are kind of 4 ideas I think we can look at as why courtship is a better model than modern dating. The first one is that there's intentionality versus a floundering of just kind of, waiting around in the dating pool and just kind of, we don't know really where we're going, but I guess we're going somewhere, but nowhere fast. We're running in circles. And so the intentionality is just better because a lot of modern dating, I mean, this was back to the dating books of the early 2000s. I mean, my wife had a book that basically started out with, it's not meant to last.
Yeah.
That was about dating. That was the first thing it taught. It's not meant to last. And so it's like,
So what's the point?
What are we doing, right? And so the idea is that there's an intentionality versus a floundering that happens. Another thing I would say also is that there's a safety in courtship versus a vulnerability.
Yeah,
When we send our
guardrails.
children, especially our girls, into the world to just figure it out, they're vulnerable to predators.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
That's just straight up scary, honestly.
Exactly.
And honestly, I think it's reckless disregard by a father to do so. Hey, I'm just going to send you to that sorority on the other side of the country. Have fun. That makes me ill to even consider as a father.
It denies both nature and sin nature.
Yep.
To do that, right?
Yeah. I also think there's a point where in a courtship, you have a more relaxed relationship versus a pressured or like an awkward one, right? So we talked about a little bit, people who date always have to put their best foot forward. And that's how that relationship is. Whereas when you're having a courtship, right? Exactly. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a courtship model, because we're trying to like actually learn about people, there's actually a mediator who's kind of who is objective over it. You can be yourself, and we can work through these things, right?
So I will take a little exception with this one, only from the standpoint of I have seen some courtship situations, and I have seen how terribly awkward they are. Okay, but let's just be honest. Dating should be seen as more awkward than it actually is. So let's be a little bit fair.
Just like public school kids are the weird ones.
Just another encouragement to families to. I remember being really turned off by courtship. I grew up in a homeschool community, and we observed some of this courtship stuff This was back when the I Kiss Dating Goodbye stuff was pretty popular. For some good reason, but I remember just seeing the awkwardness and because there is, I think there's good that you're not just allowing couples to be just alone all the time with temptation and figuring things out on their own. The other challenge is that there's often, perhaps even always, other people around, and there's very much a gawking, a talking about, a joking, and a making fun of, and all that kind of stuff that I think can add to a lot of awkwardness.
Especially when the family's assuming the outcome before you've even gotten to know each other.
Correct.
The family's already planning your children's names, and you're like, "Hey, this is our first dinner together."
there is sometimes pressure that can be applied in an awkward manner. And so the way they're talked about, and sometimes talked about in their presence, is I think can be a challenge that needs to be thought through better and perhaps overcome. Some things you can't always avoid. It's not like dating necessarily solves all of that. My point is just that it's not that courtship removes all pressure or awkwardness. In some ways, I've seen anyway, it be done in that it heightens it.
It funnels it in a productive way. It's just then it's on us as fathers to be careful that we're not contributing.
To help shepherd the people around the relationship as well, right?
So I think a good clarification I can make is what you're explaining about, especially like families like, hey, we're going to do that. That's actually leaning more into the arranged, where it's like, hey, we think you guys are perfect. Figure it out. We're going to make this happen. That's actually more of an arranged where you're kind of treating your children more like objects than you are people. Which is, we'll get to that in a minute, But the idea, when I talk about relaxed versus a pressured or awkward thing, I mean, think about it. Dating today, you find a stranger, maybe from the internet. You have no idea who they are, what they're like.
You're hoping it's actually the opposite
and
gender.
And then, as a man, you have to try to figure out how to impress this person first try, not knowing anything about this person, what they like. So all of a sudden, and look, I mean,
there's pressure and awkwardness there for sure.
Exactly. And so like the idea of like, it's basically saying, look, here's this minefield. I forget where all the mines are. Run as fast as you can. Okay. That's exactly what it is right now. That is what the modern dating is right now, especially when you're on like TikTok and all that kind of stuff. And women are like, he has to spend a certain amount of money on a first date before I'll even consider it. It's like, why are we setting these weird things that are not really red flag? I mean, what's so bad about a coffee date? There are actually women who are like, if he invites me to coffee, it's a no because he needs to spend $200 on me on a first date. And it's like, well, why? Yeah. And so that's the awkwardness. They also want a guy who's
6'5"
with that. Whereas if you think about with like a courtship, where it's more relaxed, is especially if it's in the context of the church. Families can invite the people over for dinner and have a fellowship meal.
I think that's huge. Right? So ideally, right, we talked about idealism in this, right? Ideally, these are families that hopefully already have an existing friendship. So part of what alleviates that awkwardness, it can also heighten it, frankly. Right. Like I said, I mean, I know there are legitimately two families I can think of, one at your church, one at my church, that I'm pretty sure have already married off two of their children, and their children are like 5. So, right? So, I mean, like, it's true. There's going to be pressure on that. And I know this because my wife even, they had good family friends growing up, and there was a son, they had like 5 sons. And, there was like this whole thing where, the moms always planned that their kids would get married. And then my wife goes off to college, meets me, and ends up marrying me. And I had the awkward moment where I actually had to go get like this guy's approval because it was like the best for, anyway, it was a whole thing. So like there are moments like that. But ideally, if we are doing a good job of fostering Christian community, these are going to be families that we're meeting within, maybe not in our local church, but in churches that we're in, relationship with, throughout the valley or our context geographically. But the idea is that we're cultivating not just a courtship, but a friendship between families that hopefully will last. Because to your earlier point, I'm going to have Thanksgiving dinner with these people. I want to make sure that that's going to be an enjoyable, productive conversation and holiday rather than a time bomb every single year.
But what I've seen is that some of the awkwardness is where these two people are trying to get to know each other, to trying to communicate about things that are valuable and things that matter. And when there's constant gawking and never, I get the problem of privacy, where you've added temptation, and that's not what I'm getting at. But I am getting at allow them to be able to communicate and have a measure of space wherein all the siblings aren't always constantly around, where they can never. We allow you to be together in the presence of everyone publicly, but then you actually can't really get to know each other in some meaningful way.
And then everyone blows out the cameras and are recording and waiting for the first, moment of affection.
Right. Everybody, yeah. All the teasing that goes along with that. Right.
And that's also why, the idea of trying to think about what courtship really is, right?
Yeah.
It isn't this, and that's why there's a difference between dating and arranging it, right? There is a point where, as a family unit, we can try to facilitate a space
what
where
is
we need to
natural?
be. We just need to be mindful of that. The idea that yes, we want these two to meet and get to know each other, but let's not be weird about it.
That's
right. I mean, like, this isn't high school, right? We're not going to sit here and gossip and, oh, look at that. They're all doing that kind of stuff. It's like, well, of course they are, because he came to me and said that he wanted to do it. Yeah. So it shouldn't be awkward.
That's right. It doesn't have to be. I'm just saying that it can be if we're not careful, if we're not thinking about these different elements.
Which means that, especially for us that have daughters, that means we also need to be thinking intentionally. It's good for us as fathers to ask our daughters, hey, what would actually be enjoyable? What would make it less awkward for you? What sort of things can we do together as families? What sort of things can we do, to help facilitate this, that is going to make this more, palatable to you? Like, the opinion of our daughters in those cases is important. We should be trying to facilitate an environment that'll be a blessing to her, that'll make her feel comfortable, because obviously that's an awkward thing. Hey, Dad, I'm going to invite this guy over to dinner who wants to marry me. You talked to his dad already, I found out. So cool. This is weird, right? I mean, I can imagine. I have two daughters. I can imagine how that conversation might go one day. So I feel like we do have an obligation as fathers to then have that conversation and prepare to make it as little fuss about it as possible.
It comes down to the mediator seeking to be a good mediator.
Exactly.
Right? And to make sure that there's the proper parameters for success.
And as a good mediator too, and this goes into the last point I have, the objective versus the subjective. As a mediator, you need to want to be creating the best environment for the most objective viewing.
That's right.
Right? We don't want to create a subjective thing. And this is what happens sometimes with families who have married off every single one of their kids, right? Yeah. It's the idea is that subjectively, it's like, oh, I like these parents, so yeah, let's just make our families a thing. That's a very subjective thing to do. And especially when it comes to dating, dating is by nature a subjective thing, because you're in the middle of it. Emotions are high, tensions are high, pressure is high. So it's all a subjective thing of, maybe I go pursue this, maybe I don't. Whereas if you have a mediator who's kind of above it, who's seeing both sides, who is actually an audience to this thing, they can sit there and say, hey, you guys don't work together at all. You guys are too awkward together. You guys are whatever. Or you can say, hey, you guys actually really jive well. Because there's been times where people have met each other and they're like, I think I was really awkward. And I'm like, I can just tell you from watching you two, there's no awkwardness. You guys are perfect for each other, right? I mean, that's the thing where someone who's kind of above it, who's kind of outside of it. Because look,
we can help you overcome your own insecurities, frankly, in those moments.
Exactly. I mean, when it comes to two people, I am already married. I don't need to impress anybody. I don't need to think highly of anybody, right? So I can be as honest as I absolutely need to be.
If wisdom is close enough, then wisdom has something to add.
Yeah.
Right.
Good.
And so so that's this thing where there's more intentionality, there's more safety, it can be more relaxed, and it's more objective than dating. That is what courtship is.
So we're going to arrange marriages next. Right?
Yes. So the other side, though, side is to then arrange marriages. So how is courtship better than arranged marriage? Excuse me there. The first thing that I have here is that there's a freedom in courtship versus a bondage. So in an arranged marriage, you must do what your father tells you to do.
Yeah.
Right? We made this agreement when you were 2, and so you have to do it. That is a bondage. That is almost a slavery there, where you have to do this thing, or even you have to I'm going to refer to Fiddler on the Roof, but they had a matchmaker. As soon as the matchmaker said you and you, it was almost like it was just
binding.
bound.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was absolutely binding. And it's like, well, in courtship, and as we mentioned earlier, there's a thing where fathers and daughters have a partnership, right? Mm-hmm. If a boy comes and the daughter's like, I don't think so, you don't have to force anything. You just say, okay, not the next one. We'll move on to the next one.
And a father might say, I think you should reconsider. Let's
think about
this
it some more time.
I don't think you're necessarily seeing all the right things. Can we work towards this? But if it's absolutely not, a father would be wise not to force
Exactly.
anything upon his daughter in that way. And so when there's a respect and a trust and a love, then a father and daughter work really in concert for the good of everyone, the family, but especially for the daughter.
Well, and we can make recommendations all day long as fathers and say, hey, this guy is interested in you. He's a hard worker. He has his own business. He's a solid believer. I mean, I think he's a deacon candidate. I mean, I can give a resume to my daughter all day long. And if she's like, yeah, I just can't picture myself, submitting to him the rest of my life. Okay, cool. I'm not going to ask my daughter to go submit to some man that she has no desire to do so, right? Like that would be setting her up for misery. So I need to recognize that. Now, if he ticks all those boxes, I'm probably going to at least talk to her a little bit and be like, well, what is it that you're not seeing? Because obviously, let's be honest, physical attraction is part of this whole equation. So that is something we need to talk about. It does matter. It's not the end all be all. We don't want it to be the only measuring stick, but obviously at the end of the day, if you're just like, I'm just not really interested, that's important. We don't want to shrug that off.
His voice is like fingernails on a chalkboard.
Yeah. His voice doesn't put me to sleep at night. Right.
And there should be a freedom in that, right?
Yeah,
we
exactly.
shouldn't be so gung ho on like this one particular person that like, you have to do this, right?
Yeah.
Like if I was actually like 6'5" and my daughter was really tall or whatever, and I say, hey, look, you have to marry another tall person because we need an NBA player. Like that's really weird and awkward.
Now you sound like Elon Musk,
Right?
bioengineering children.
Yeah. Now here's the thing: if my daughter has those genes and was like, I'd really like to raise an NBA player, and here's the guy who will help me do that most, we can work with that,
Sure.
right? I mean, that's okay, but there should still be a freedom in that.
Yep. Well, that speaks back to the objective subjective thing too.
Yeah.
If you're literally like, these are the traits that you must find, and that even goes back to the concept of dating, right? These ladies have these checklists that are so unreasonable and absurd.
Newsflash, he doesn't exist.
Yeah, right. And if he did, you really think he'd pick you? Like, let's just be, honest. Right?
Well, if he's not already picked, there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Could be.
So,
Could be.
so if he does check all those boxes, you got to ask yourself, why isn't he already married?
Yeah. And by the way, that's vice versa for the women too.
Absolutely. Yep.
So the other thing though is
sourdough like crazy.
so the next idea why courtship's a little better than is better than arranged marriages is because there's the idea of duty versus love. And so this is where I thought about the Fiddler on the Roof. There's a song in there called "Do You Love Me?"
What?
Right. And what's interesting about that song is the wife is saying, "Well, I washed your clothes for 25 years." Okay,
So I guess I do.
fine, but do you love me? Like, right? It's the idea of that when you arrange a marriage and say this is your duty, all of a sudden you can have, and I know that in like India they always, say, hey, do your duty and then you'll learn to love later. It's like, okay, but there still is like you think about a marriage that is built on duty alone is not really a good marriage, right? Even if you have kids, even if you have whatever, it really doesn't, It really doesn't jive well. Now, that's not to say there isn't a duty in marriage.
Duty and love aren't enemies, but
Exactly.
but alone,
Right.
love without any sense of duty and duty without any sense of love really is lacking significantly, right?
Well, especially when you look at scripture, right? I mean, we see, you quoted it earlier, this concept of being intoxicated with your bride. Yeah, I'm not intoxicated with my bride out of a sense of duty. I'm intoxicated with my bride out of a sense of passion and love and romance and a desire for intimacy. Those are all good things. However, what allowed me to be able to pursue those things freely and with joy is my sense of duty to the marriage institution, and that I'm going to work and provide a
Responsibility to do the
home,
right
take
thing.
responsibility. Yeah. I'm going to bear the burden of those things so that I can delight in my wife in those ways and enjoy our friendship and intimacy.
Absolutely. And then the last one I have here is when you arrange marriages, you treat your children like objects rather than people.
Yeah.
And that's the thing where, even as we're thinking about the awkwardness that can exist where, we have families that have young kids and they're already trying to figure out how to get them to marry. It's like, well, look, your children are not this object, this kind of thing that you just have on the side that is a part of your life. I mean, it's not like you can go to like have a dog and take it to a breeder and get puppies out of it. It's the idea of that these are actual people, right? And we need to treat our children like people, not like objects, which is why when we think about, the gawking and all this awkwardness, It's because you're treating them like zoo animals, right?
Yes.
We just
Yeah.
set them up inside a van exhibit. And
Well,
now
it's
we're
for your
rolling through and
entertainment
taking
at that
pictures.
point. Yeah, it's
know?
a
They're inside the
production.
cage, and everyone else is walking up and pointing and laughing.
Install
Exactly.
some safety glass.
Yeah, and so it's just like, we need to not do that. And like when we arrange marriages, while that is a father rule thing, it isn't treating our children as people, which is what they are. They are image bearers of God, and we need to treat them like that, not like objects.
Well, what if a young woman doesn't really have a father that's bought into this? Maybe he's not a Christian. Maybe he's not that good of a man. Maybe a young woman has been saved after leaving her home, and she's
On her own.
On her own. She's not under his roof or those types of things. Maybe do you have any comments or thoughts on what some of those young women might be able to do?
Boy, do I.
Yeah. No, this is actually good because I think you've done a good job, Luke. And I think we've laid out now a clear argument for why this should be what we pursue. The question then is, how do we as the church actually promote this within it? And you just gave a huge example, because that's very much many of our people's experience. So
Well,
what do we do to build it?
Because we already talked about there's this ideal, right? So we've talked a lot about the ideal. You're working within your family, you're working within a Christian household, you're working with a Christian father who is thoughtful and wise and understands these things that you're dealing within your own church. But yet, even within our own church, we don't have all of those ideal scenarios. And so how do we think about these principles when the ideal is not necessarily what we have in front of us?
Yeah. So for those families for those people who are single and don't necessarily have those families involved, my suggestion would be to involve your pastors. Your pastors are supposed to be your spiritual fathers. They are supposed to know you. They are discipling you.
And we're responsible for you.
Exactly.
frankly.
And so like the idea is like we can set up as pastors, we can set up an environment where two people can meet, and we can be that observer person. We can be that father figure to look over and to be able to say yay, nay, or whatever it is, or even to answer questions. Hey, was this okay? Was that okay? To be able to also teach and disciple. Like, if you have a man who's like, oh, did I say this right? I felt awkward. We can say, hey, this is how women really are. This is something to keep in mind, and those different things. And so my bit of advice would be, if you are single, try to involve your pastor. And by the way, we on this podcast, we have two churches here. And so there's other churches that are in the valley. It's one of those things where amongst pastors, you can even ask your pastor, hey, can you call another church and just see if there's potential people? Yep. And then what's great about that is that when you think about reaching out even to other churches, if we use this model and use the pastor as that mediator, at the end of the day, the guy at the other church isn't just going to the girl, or the girl's not just finding the guy. You're actually meeting a pastor first. You're actually meeting someone who actually cares about you, who should have a little bit of training in mediation and premarital counseling, who should understand a little bit of what relationships ought to be.
Yeah.
And so pastors, we can, and by the way, I mean, just back to the 1689, one of the things that the 1689 says is that pastors need to be paid enough to be hospitable. Well, here's a hospitality that we could do as pastors to help our single people. Because if we're going to just be transparent and honest, the church has failed our single people like we don't believe.
Yeah. Either by esteeming singleness as some sort of like idol to be attained to, sort of like like the sin of empathy is, right? The sin of empathy is telling single people that it's a blessing and not a curse for everyone, or by simply talking about the glories of marriage and never helping anyone get there.
Exactly. I mean, if I believe that marriage is a good thing, I want everyone to be married. And so if there are single people, I mean, I could have a dinner at my house, right? which by the way, alleviates the awkwardness of having a first date and all this other stuff. And not just that, but we can.
Because now they're uncomfortable because the pastor's watching instead of. But it'll build them bonding together.
But then again, though, it's still one of those things where it's like, as a pastor, if I'm supposed to know my flock, and I can interview a potential spouse and probably be able to tell right away yes or no. Yeah. Right. And there's also the thing where it's like, just as all the courtship rules apply, right? If the two people decide that they don't think it's right or they don't like each other, you can always say no. And there's no real pressure to have to get married. But like, here's a way, especially if we want our single people to pursue righteousness, to pursue marriage righteously. Courtship under the auspices of a pastor is one of the best ways to actually do that. And I think, that's something that we should, as pastors, be thinking about doing. I mean, we think about however many pastors we have at our church. I mean, for Stone Mountain, we have 2 pastors. There's a potential to set 2 relationships up, right? Mm-hmm. Just do one at a time, one couple at a time. I think Truth Family has 3, right?
3 what?
Elders.
Correct.
Right. So there's a chance for 3 you could be putting, for pastor, I'm just saying, just do one at a time. Don't have people every single day.
Yeah, we're not playing matchmaker, right?
Yeah. But the whole point is that we have an opportunity where we can be hospitable, not only to our singles, which when you have young families and stuff like that, singles do get put to the side, and it's not intentional, but we do gravitate to people that we have more in common with. Yeah. And by the providence of God, with our family, we've actually been able to serve more singles and be less with other families. And so I've just heard, hey, here's what this is, here's what that is. And even as you talked about earlier with thinking about asking our daughters, what's the best way to meet a person? Our singles have those things too, right?
Yeah. Do you enjoy board games?
Right. No. Why are we just giving the singles of our church phone numbers and just saying, go figure it out? That's what the world does. The church ought not to do that. And we have the opportunity to, within the church, to have this mediation. Now, I will make one caveat though. If we are talking about older people, I would recommend personally that pastors do that primarily, not just random lay people within the church. Because even as you mentioned, Danny, people can get really invested in things. And pastors have to be trained to do premarital counseling, to be trained to objectively look at high tension, high emotional situations and parse it all out. Mm-hmm. And so that would be the other thing too. And I think if there's any, I'll just say this right now, if there are any pastors who happen to be listening to this, who are hearing this and say, hey, this is a great idea, I'd like to talk more about it, just email Stone Mountain, stonemountainministries@gmail.com, right?
Yep, there you go.
Cool, I have it memorized. And reach out. I know I personally would love to talk to other pastors about this. Yep. Because I think even in our Treasure Valley, we have these different churches that we could be calling each other and getting our singles married off, right? Not allowing them to persist in the affliction of singleness.
Well, on that note, one of my favorite things I've been seeing in sort of this young, because you hit it well with sort of underserved singles in the Reformed Church, especially with a refocusing on the family, a resurgence of young married people having children, not delaying marriage. What we're seeing now is that it starts creating almost a pressure on some of these, 20, 22, 25-year-old single people that they feel like they've already missed the boat because they're seeing people getting married young around them, starting to have kids, and it puts them sort of in this awkward position, right? And so as we refocus on that, it creates almost a greater divide than there ever has been between the singles and the marrieds within the church. And so one of my favorite things that I've been seeing become honestly a trend is the concept of singles mixers at Christian conferences. The fact that, they're talking about, hey, we just had our 3rd wedding from this mixer that we did at the conference. That's great. So put it on the docket for True Script, this fall maybe. But I mean, the idea there is that we can cultivate an atmosphere where, hey, this isn't just some Christian dating site. This is actually real people that have real authority and elders overseeing them. And that when you meet them, you're not just meeting some random person from who knows where. You're meeting someone who actually is involved in, they're churchmen, right? They're actually involved in a church somewhere where they're in submission to an eldership, and we can actually talk. And so, if we cultivate relationship between our churches, between other churches in the valley, gotta convert those Paedo Baptist young ladies, by dominion. Okay. If we're building those relationships, hey, I make that joke because I can't tell you how many times the Presbyterians make it against me. They're like, hey, we're just going to marry your daughters. And I say, over my dead body. And then we move on. But we're friends. It's good. But no, if we can cultivate a relationship, and I'm kidding, but if we can cultivate a relationship between churches, we are actually enlarging then, if you will, the pool of quality suitors right? Because we're not just saying like, hey, let's just throw you into the deep end of the world. We're saying, hey, here is a place where there are people that know the gospel, that live the gospel, that share our values, that want to live out obedience to the scripture. Here are some people that actually have a greater variety.
Well, and what's happening in the culture at large right now? Young men are actually moving more conservative. And
Hardcore right.
And one of the things that's also happening at the same time is a lot of young single women are moving left.
Yep.
And talk about, and actually there's a couple that I know outside of our church, non-Christians actually, and it's very funny when I hear him talk because he's politically like he's conservative. So for instance, he's on Team Trump, and his wife can't stand the sight of Trump.
Oh,
And it's just that they have such a polar opposite kind of view of the world. But what's happening is that's what's being created right now in our broader culture, where young men are more conservative, and then you got these more liberal women. And what you just said was super important, because what we need to have is conservative churchmen who are men, and conservative churchmen who are women, who then recognize where to find the right kind of spouse that God has designed for you, and that's going to be within relationships of churches, where and there is something to the value of churches cooperating with each other, having relationships wherein there is like-mindedness, where there is an ability to find suitable partners.
Yeah, well, and I think that's also speaks to the rising trend of these young conservative men going to Rome and to the Eastern Orthodox churches because they know that they can find brides there, and that there's a strong, at least perceived traditionalism, strong masculinity, etc. It's a false perception, but nevertheless, it's one that's winning the day. And so we need to actually demonstrate that here within biblical Christianity, within Reformation thought, within the church, the church broadly, evangelical Protestant, that we're building that new Christendom, concept, and that the household is going to be esteemed here. We're going to hopefully, Lord willing, train up our sons and daughters to fulfill those with joy. The challenge, I think, is I feel like we're in a transition generation, right? My sons and daughters are being raised that way. Your sons and daughters are being raised that way. But what about the ones that are early adults right now? They're the ones that are sort of in this difficult spot. And so I think now more than ever, this concept of involving elders, involving biblical, godly authorities in your life,
right?
Yeah.
Yep, I think is now or never, because if we can jump in and help cultivate these marriages, the next generation is going to bear so much more fruit. And so that's a glorious opportunity and a glorious obligation. I think we as pastors have neglected that responsibility. So I appreciate you calling that out.
Yeah, and I think just even if you do, like, if there are mixers and stuff like that, I think it'd be one thing. It's like, hey, we met at this mixer, we kind of like each other. Ask your pastor, hey, would you be willing to have dinner with us and watch us interact and just give your opinions afterwards? There's nothing wrong about that. And as a pastor, I should want to be hospitable to everybody within my church. That includes the single people. And this is one way that we can do that. This is one way that we can help them out. We can actually minister to them. We can actually lead them into good places here.
Amen.
Very good. Well, let's bring this to a close here. What would be maybe your favorite resource on this particular topic? I think we probably have some agreement on probably one of our favorite or our main one. Luke, what would you say is one of the best books on this subject?
So a great book on the subject of courtship, and especially for fathers and daughters, is Vodi Bachum's What He Must Be to Marry My Daughter.
That's the best one I can think of.
And
Pastor Luke actually did a series on that when you were at the well, right?
I actually did a Sunday school series on this, which I should put in the show notes.
And I actually did a series on biblical manhood and womanhood, and talking about prophet, priest, provider, and protector, right? That's actually not simply about courtship, but it's actually about what it means to be a godly man. This is what God has called us to be. Yeah. And so therefore, of course, it's the right way to look at being prepared for marriage, right?
Right. The best part about that video series, I'll just give
I've seen the video series, yeah.
So it got recorded and I did it at the well. It's on YouTube.
Series.
Yeah.
Oh, your series, got it.
Yeah, so the best part of that series is somewhere, so we'll just encourage people to go watch it. Somewhere in there, I admit that I've played Barbies with my daughter.
Well, that's all the time we have for Truth Today. We want to thank you for joining us.
It is a funny moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I would actually follow that up if you're going to be on the Vodibacum Trail. Follow that up by reading, what is it, Father Shepherds? Family Shepherds.
Yeah.
Because that's going to go hand in hand as you follow, what it looks like to be a godly man. That's also going to help, I think, give some really clear guidelines about your responsibilities as a father in the home. And then, I can actually personally attest. I listened to Pastor Danny's series. That was a Sunday night series I think you went through, right? I listened to that and your parenting series as well. Last year, I crushed through quite a few of those while working, and they were very edifying. So I would second that. Some other books just in general that I found to be helpful and that I've had, my young men are reading and going to be reading in the coming years. This is one area where I do think Doug Wilson is pretty helpful. He has a book, it's called My Life for Yours, which is about sort of the Christian household in general. He also has a book called Her Hand in Marriage, which is specifically about courting. Yep. I'm not going to say I agree with every single analogy, especially because he does highly emphasize the concept of covenant household. So I might have some disagreements there, but in general, there's a lot of really good principles in those books, and in the book Reforming Marriage as well. I found to be very very helpful.
Well, for young families, Doug Wilson's book Future Men is I found to be really good as well. That's a good one.
And also another one, especially with if you have teenage boys as they're approaching manhood and wanting to pursue marriage, Fidelity was another good one. That was about slaying lust and having a right view of marriage.
And Federal Husband.
Yeah,
he has a book Federal Husband as well, which is really
in general. That's one of the areas where obviously I'm going to have a lot of disagreements with Wilson on various theological things. But when it comes to
anyway,
well, won't even get into that. But just in general with our covenant theology, but the household books I do find to be very helpful. Other than that, the only other resource that came to mind when I was thinking about this, Paul Washer actually has a lecture series on courtship that it's been a while since I've watched it, so full disclosure there, but I remember it being very encouraging when I did listen to it. So in general, the idea here is there is a plethora of biblical truth out there. There's not a plethora of teaching, frankly, in the world. If you go look up Christian courting or Christian dating, you're going to find a ton of garbage, frankly. And so I'm going to actually say that the most trusted resource that I really want to encourage people on is to go to your local pastors, to go to your local elders, and to walk through this in real life. Because we can prescribe books and videos all day long and sermon series, and they're helpful and they're tools, right? But at the end of the day, it's living life in the community of faith within the church that is going to be the best tutor, the best instructor, and the best way forward in this. And so I think that's been the whole point of this episode, is that we want to be elders and pastors and shepherds that care well for our people and help in that.
Well, that's all the time we have for Truth Today. We want to thank you for joining us. And until next time, we hope that you will grow in your love and commitment to Christ and His church as we are sanctified in the truth. God's word is truth.